Hello and welcome to the Natural Balance Hoof Care Corner. Last week we ended with the distortion in the back part of the foot. We're going to take right off from there and talk about medial lateral balance. What we mean by that is that balancing the foot from side to side. The objective has always been to get the coffin bone flat to the ground from one side to the other. Not necessarily from front to back, because there's a variation in feet. Some horses have a more upright foot, some have a flatter foot. The requirements for the position of the bone relative to the ground can vary from one foot to the other on the same horse. So there's guidelines that we'll talk about how that is regulated and how we can find that perfect balance for each foot. But basically, the medial lateral balance, we're concerned with seeing that this bone is flat to the ground from this perspective. So if you recall the last slide of last week's session, we trimmed one side of that heel down, and it straightened that whole hoof wall out just by simply getting that heel lower and closer to the sole. The heel that was left taller had a much more abrupt curve in the heel. Now that's a very simple and easy guideline to follow, and you can tell which side of the foot, without knowing any more about it than that, which side of the foot is higher simply by which side that curls the most. And using the sole as a guide has been a huge help to making this job of medial lateral balance as simple and reliable for the comfort and well-being of the horses. So again, in doing so means that the joints above that bone are going to be parallel as well. And you have to look at this from this perspective. I'm going to just mock this up. Let's say this is P2, the joint right here. And if this foot was trimmed so that one side was higher than the other, you'd see that their foot would, as the foot engaged itself into the ground and the horse weighted that foot, you would be bearing more weight into one side of that joint than the other. Not only in this joint, but the joint above it, and the joint above that, and the joint above that. Because all of these joints are designed to bend only in one direction. A very small amount of leniency from side to side. So it's very important that this foot be trimmed in a manner that will allow it to be flat to the ground and all of these joints line up perfectly. If you look at this from a simple, basic concept, and if you have to realize that wild horses, for instance, and even domestic horses in an environment where they are barefooted and can wear their foot to their own liking, and they keep their feet maintained perfectly, you'll see that every one of those horses has a hoof wall that is worn to the level of the sole equally all the way around. Some horses will have a slightly more upright foot, some will have a flatter foot, but basically the hoof wall is always worn to the level of the sole. All of the studies that have been done have shown this very clearly. There's even been research done by leading researchers around the country that have proven this same concept. Simply the fact that this sole beneath the bone is the same on each side makes it real simple to evaluate medial lateral hoof balance. I'm going to move on here. This is part of the research that we've done, and we found that preparing the hoof wall by taking away the exfoliating material, the chalky material here, finding a waxy surface, and then trim this hoof wall down to the level of that waxy area on both sides of the foot. With every foot that we've done that with, we found that the distance from the bottom of the bone here to the ground has been exactly the same on each side, which seems to parallel all of the research that's been done in this area so far. And I'm sure that there's going to be differences, but so far every horse that we've done this, every foot that we've prepared this way, dissected in that manner and measured, we found that every one of them has been exactly the same on each side. So makes it much easier to evaluate medial lateral balance for horses that may seem to be pigeon-toed or toed out. Quite often farriers are pressured by horse owners to so-called straighten the horse's legs out, particularly those who are in halter classes and whatnot. If you remember back in the foal session that we had about what is required for foals to straighten their own legs out early in their life and the stimulation that occurred, a lot of horses that end up with legs that are toed out or are severely toed in oftentimes miss that opportunity to get their legs properly straightened. So the leg has been adapted to that particular conformation, and at a later date, 2 and 3 years old, there's nothing you're going to do to straighten that leg any more than it is by then. Keep in mind that the growth plates have all closed by the time the horse is 3 and 4 years old. So whatever the leg's position next to the ground is at that time, that's the way it's supposed to be. So any amount of severe rasping on one side of the foot more than the other is only going to upset these joints, as we talked about before, and that in itself is going to create some lameness issues. Keep in mind that it's very important that this foot always be perfectly flat to the ground. I can remember back in my years of doing this kind of work, especially working on halter horses, when I was forced to trim more off of one side of the foot than the other. And durable as horses are, they seem to get by at least for a reasonable length of time. And it wasn't until later on in their life did we realize what we were actually doing. We actually were creating more wear on one side of the joints of the lower limbs, and creating an early arthritis in all of these, practically every one of the horses that we tried this with. And so looking back and seeing what I could have done was a lot different than what I actually did. And I really feel bad that a lot of those horses suffered because of the pressure I took getting those horses to be straight for halter classes. And I think that as we look at what's really important now in measuring the distance, looking at the bottom of the foot instead of down the limb, it's been a huge help to getting the coffin bone flat to the ground. And whatever the leg conformation of that horse is what they're going to have, and that's what is most important, is that the soundness of the animal has to take precedence over whether the limb is perfectly straight or not. So I think I think it's important to rethink a lot of our ethics about what straight-legged horses are. I think those that have adapted to a slight limb deformity are going to be much healthier if it's just left in that manner. And I think most farriers are aware of that, particularly farriers that have been in this business for a number of years. They've realized that they've actually not done the best for horses if they've tried to pressure so what we call crank them around or force them to stand in a straightforward position, when in fact they probably need to be slightly toed in or toed out. So we'll close with that for this week as we're out of time, and we'll continue next week with more of the information about the sole and the sole callus. So thank you very much.